Sometimes losing everything teaches you what truly matters. Sometimes it takes a child to remind a broken man that kindness still exists in this world. Frank had spent 40 years working at the steel mill, building a life with his beloved wife Martha in their cozy home on Maple Street. But cancer took Martha, medical bills took the house, and pride wouldn't pay for food. Now, at 63, Frank wandered the snowy streets of his hometown, invisible to neighbors who once knew his name. On this cold afternoon, outside Miller's bakery, hunger finally overcame shame as he approached 7-year-old Lila sitting alone with warm bread and bright eyes. When Frank whispered those desperate words, "Can I eat with you?" what she said back would crack open his heart and change everything he thought he knew about human goodness. What could this little girl possibly say to heal a broken man's soul? Before we continue, let us know what city you're tuning in from. And if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I have something incredibly moving to share with you. The foreclosure notice had been folded and refolded so many times that the creases had worn through the paper in places, creating tiny windows that let the winter light shine through. Frank kept it in his coat pocket, not as a reminder of what he'd lost, but as proof that it had all been real. The house on Maple Street with its yellow kitchen and the garden where Martha grew tomatoes every summer, the mortgage payments he'd never missed in 37 years, the life that had made sense. Before the sickness came, Frank Delacroix had been the kind of man who fixed his neighbors' fences without being asked and never missed Sunday service at St. Michael's. He'd worked the same shift at Millfield Steel. For 4 decades, his lunch pail packed each morning by Martha's careful hands. She'd write little notes on napkins, "Love you, be safe," that he'd find tucked between his sandwich and thermos. Even after all those years, she still did that. Their house had been modest but proud, with white shutters that Frank repainted every 3 years and a front porch where they'd sit on summer evenings watching the neighborhood children chase fireflies. Martha would hum old hymns while she shelled peas or mended clothes, her voice soft and steady as the rhythm of seasons. They'd never had children of their own. The Lord had other plans, Martha always said, but they'd loved each other with the deep, quiet devotion that comes from choosing the same person every morning for 42 years. The cancer started as a cough that wouldn't go away, just a persistent tickle, Martha called it, waving off Frank's concerns with that gentle stubbornness he'd come to know so well. By the time Dr. Chen convinced her to get the X-ray, the shadows in her lungs had already begun their cruel work. Stage 3, they said, as if giving it a number would somehow make it manageable. Frank became a different kind of man then. He learned the language of insurance forms and treatment protocols, memorized the layout of university hospitals' oncology wing, and discovered that hope could be measured in millimeters on a scan. He drove Martha to every appointment, held her hand through every treatment, and slept in the reclining chair beside her hospital bed more nights than he could count. The medical bills arrived like a slow avalanche. First, the diagnostic tests, then the surgery, then the chemotherapy that cost more in 3 months than Frank had ever imagined possible. Their modest savings disappeared first, then the retirement account they'd been building for 30 years. Frank took out a second mortgage on the house, then a third. He sold his truck and borrowed money against his pension. None of it mattered. As long as Martha was fighting, she held on for 18 months, growing thinner and more fragile until she was mostly spirit held together by determination and Frank's unwavering presence. On her last morning, she'd opened her eyes and smiled at him with something that looked almost like relief. "Take care of yourself, Frank," she'd whispered. "Promise me you'll find a way to be happy again." He'd promised, of course. How could he not? But 3 days after the funeral, when he was still wearing the same black suit and the house smelled like the casseroles the church ladies had brought, the bank's representative knocked on his door with papers that made his promise seem impossible to keep. The foreclosure process was swift and merciless. Frank had 90 days to catch up on payments that had fallen 6 months behind, or find somewhere else to live. He'd applied for every job he could think of, But at 61, with a high school education and a resume that showed 4 decades at a plant that had closed the year before, his prospects were grim. The younger men got the warehouse jobs. The retail positions went to college kids who could work weekends and holidays. Frank's pride had kept him from asking for help until it was too late to matter. Moving day had been the worst day of his life since Martha's funeral. Watching strangers carry out the rocking chair where she'd sat every evening, the kitchen table where they'd shared 40 years of meals, the bed where she'd drawn her last breath, it felt like losing her all over again. He'd kept only what would fit in 2 duffel bags, some clothes, a few photographs, and Martha's recipe box that still smelled faintly of cinnamon and vanilla. The first weeks of homelessness had been a crash course in humiliation. Frank learned which churches served meals on which days, discovered that the library was warm and no one bothered you if you sat quietly in the corner, and found that pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. He slept in the park when weather permitted, in the bus station when it didn't, and in the doorway of abandoned buildings when he had no other choice. The hardest part wasn't the hunger or the cold or even the way people looked through him as if he'd become invisible. The hardest part was walking past his old life every day. Millfield was a small town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and Frank's route to the soup kitchen took him directly past the house on Maple Street. He'd tried taking other paths, but somehow his feet always carried him down that familiar sidewalk, past the yellow kitchen window where strangers now lived their own version of the life he'd lost. Miller's Bakery sat on the corner of Main and 3rd, its windows always fogged with warmth and the scent of fresh bread drifting out every time someone opened the door. Frank had been walking past it twice a day for 3 months, watching the familiar rhythm of small-town life continue without him. He recognized most of the customers: Mrs. Patterson, who bought a loaf of wheat bread every Tuesday; Tom Hendricks, who stopped for coffee on his way to the hardware store; the young mothers who brought their children for cookies after school. But it was the little girl who had started to break his heart. She couldn't have been more than 7, with dark hair that curled at the ends and a way of sitting very straight in her chair that suggested good manners carefully taught. She came every afternoon around 3:30, always alone, always ordering the same thing, a piece of warm bread and a cup of milk. She ate slowly, deliberately, as if each bite was precious. Sometimes she'd bring a book and read while she ate, moving her lips slightly as she worked through the words. Frank had noticed her because she reminded him of the children he and Martha had never had, but had imagined raising together. They'd talked about it sometimes in those quiet moments before sleep, what they would have named their daughter, how they would have taught her to be kind and strong and grateful for small blessings. Watching this little girl eat her simple meal with such contentment made Frank's chest ache with a longing he'd thought he'd buried with Martha. Today the snow was falling harder than it had all winter, fat flakes that stuck to everything and muffled the sounds of the town. Frank's coat, the same one he'd worn to work for 15 years, was thin and inadequate against the cold that seemed to seep into his bones and settle there. His last meal had been yesterday's lunch at the soup kitchen, and his stomach cramped, with a hollow ache that made it hard to think about anything else. He paused outside Miller's Bakery, watching the warm yellow light spill onto the sidewalk. Through the window, he could see Rose Miller moving between the display cases and ovens, with the efficient grace of someone who'd been baking bread for decades. The shop was nearly empty except for one customer at the counter and the little girl at her usual table by the window. Frank's pride warred with his hunger as he stood there in the snow, the foreclosure notice crackling in his pocket like a reminder of all the choices that had led him to this moment. He'd never begged for food before. He'd never had to. But as he watched the little girl break her bread into careful pieces, something in his resolve finally cracked. The child looked up then, as if she'd felt his presence through the glass. Their eyes met for just a moment, and Frank saw something in her expression that he hadn't seen directed at him in months. Simple human acknowledgement, without judgment or pity or fear. She was just a little girl, and he was just a man standing in the snow, and for that brief moment it was enough. Frank took a deep breath, tasting snow and hope and desperation in equal measure, and reached for the bakery door. The warmth hit Frank's face like a gentle slap as he stepped inside Miller's bakery, and for a moment he couldn't move. The air was thick with the scent of yeast and butter, cinnamon and something that might have been vanilla. It smelled like every kitchen he'd ever loved, like Martha's Sunday morning pancakes and his grandmother's Christmas cookies. It smelled like home, and the recognition nearly drove him back out into the snow. But the little girl was watching him now, her dark eyes curious but not afraid, and Frank found himself frozen between the desire to flee and the simple human need to be warm for just a few minutes. The red mittens she wore were hand-knitted, he noticed, with tiny cables that spoke of careful, patient work. Someone had made those mittens with love, the kind of love that worried about small fingers getting cold. "Can I help you?" Rose Miller's voice was cautious but not unkind. She was a woman in her 50s, with greying hair pulled back in a practical bun and flour dusted across her apron. Frank recognized her, though he wasn't sure she'd recognize him. Before the world had fallen apart, he'd occasionally stopped in to buy Martha a special loaf for Sunday dinner, or a pie for the church socials they'd attended together. Frank opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. What was he supposed to say? That he was hungry? That he'd been standing outside in the snow for 20 minutes, working up the courage to come inside? That he'd once been a respectable man who paid his bills and helped his neighbors and never imagined he'd be reduced to this? "It's okay," the little girl said suddenly, her voice clear and confident in the way that only children's voices could be. "You can sit down if you want. It's really cold outside." She gestured to the empty chair across from her small table, and Frank felt something crack open in his chest. When was the last time someone had offered him a seat? When was the last time anyone had acknowledged that he might be cold, might be tired, might be human? "Lila," Rose said gently, a note of warning in her voice. But the child, Lila, was already scooting her chair over to make more room, already pushing her plate of bread toward the center of the table, as if she'd been expecting company all along. Frank found himself moving toward the table before his mind had fully decided to do so. The chair creaked slightly under his weight, but it held, and suddenly he was sitting across from this small girl with her bright mittens and earnest expression, close enough to see the freckles scattered across her nose and the way her dark hair curled behind her ears. "I'm Lila," she said, as if they were meeting at a church picnic instead of in the strange circumstances that had brought a homeless man into her afternoon routine. "What's your name?" "Frank," he managed, his voice rough from disuse and cold. "Frank Delacroix." "That's a nice name," Lila said thoughtfully. "It sounds important, like a king or something." Despite everything, Frank almost smiled. "It's French," he said. "My grandfather came here from Quebec when he was young, looking for work." "Like you?" Lila asked, and the innocent question hit Frank like a physical blow. Looking for work. Yes, he supposed that was one way to describe what he was doing, in kinder way than most people would have put it. "Something like that," Frank said quietly. Rose Miller was still watching them from behind the counter, her expression unreadable. Frank could feel her uncertainty, her maternal instinct to protect the child warring with something else. Maybe curiosity, maybe recognition, maybe simple human decency. He didn't blame her for being cautious. He'd be cautious too if he had. "A child to protect. Are you hungry?" Lila asked, and the directness of the question nearly undid him completely. Children, Frank had observed, had a way of cutting straight through the polite fictions that adults used to make difficult situations bearable. There was no shame in Lila's voice, no judgment, just a practical concern for a fellow human being who might be in need. Frank looked at the bread on her plate, still warm from the oven, and felt his stomach clench with longing. He hadn't eaten. since yesterday, and the sight of food so close made him dizzy with want, but he was still Frank Delacroix, even if he had nothing left, and Frank Delacroix didn't take food from children. "I'm okay," he said, the lie tasting bitter on his tongue. Lila studied his face with the serious intensity that children brought to important matters. Then, without ceremony, she tore her piece of bread in half and pushed the larger portion across the table toward him. "You should eat this," she said matter-of-factly. "Grandma Rose makes the best bread in the whole world, and you look like you could use some." The words hung in the air between them, simple and devastating. Frank stared at the bread, at this child's easy generosity, and felt 40 years of careful dignity crumble like old mortar. When was the last time someone had offered to share their meal with him? When was the last time someone had looked at him and seen a person worth caring for? "Can I eat with you?" The words came out before Frank could stop them, barely more than a whisper, thick with shame and desperate hope. Lila's face lit up with genuine pleasure, as if he'd just suggested the most delightful thing in the world. "Of course you can," she said, pushing her cup of milk toward the center of the table to join the bread. "You can have mine." The simplicity of it broke him. Not, "I'll share with you," or "You can have some," but "You can have mine," spoken with the absolute conviction of someone who had never doubted that sharing was simply what people did for one another. Frank felt tears sting his eyes, and he looked down at the table, overwhelmed by the magnitude of this small girl's kindness. From behind the counter, Rose Miller cleared her throat softly. When Frank looked up, she was approaching their table, with a steaming mug of coffee and a questioning expression. "On the house," she said quietly, setting the mug down in front of Frank. "It's too cold a day for anyone to be outside without something warm." Frank wrapped his hands around the mug, feeling the heat seep into his frozen fingers. The coffee was rich and strong, and it tasted like forgiveness. He looked up at Rose, trying to find words adequate to express his gratitude, but she was already turning away, giving him the privacy to compose himself. "I knew your wife," Rose said over her shoulder, her voice gentle. "Martha was a good woman. She used to buy my cinnamon rolls for the church bake sales." The mention of Martha's name hit Frank like a physical blow, but somehow it didn't hurt, the way it usually did. Instead, it felt like a bridge across the chasm that had opened between his old life and this new one. Rose remembered Martha. Rose remembered him, not as he was now, but as he had been. "She was," Frank said simply, his voice thick with emotion. "She was the best of us." Lila was watching this exchange with the grave attention that children paid to adult conversations they didn't fully understand, but sensed were important. When Frank looked at her again, she was carefully dividing her bread into even smaller pieces, as if making it last longer would somehow make the sharing more significant. "Do you miss her?" Lila asked, and once again her directness cut through everything non-essential. "Every day," Frank said honestly. Lila nodded as if this made perfect sense. "I miss my mom and dad too. They went to heaven in a car accident when I was 5, but Grandma Rose takes care of me now, and she's really good at it." Frank felt something shift in his understanding. This little girl, this generous, kind-hearted child, was an orphan. She knew about loss, about having your whole world disappear in an instant, about learning to build something new from the wreckage of what came before. No wonder she'd recognized something in him that others had missed. No wonder she'd offered to share her bread with the confidence of someone who understood that kindness was often all people had left to give. "I'm sorry about your parents," Frank said, meaning it completely. "Thank you," Lila said solemnly. "They were really nice. Mom made the best chocolate chip cookies, and Dad knew all the words to every song on the radio. But Grandma Rose says they're still with me in here." She tapped her chest, and that makes it not hurt so much. Frank nodded, thinking of Martha's recipe box in his duffel bag, of the way her voice still spoke to him in quiet moments, of the wedding ring he still wore because taking it off felt like losing her twice. "That's very wise," he said. "Grandma Rose is the wisest person I know," Lila said proudly. "Except maybe Mrs. Patterson, but she's really old, so she's had more time to learn things." Despite everything, Frank found himself almost smiling. "How old are you, Lila?" 7 3/4, she said precisely. "I'll be 8 in March. Grandma Rose is going to make me a birthday cake with 8 candles and everything." Frank thought about all the birthdays he and Martha had celebrated together, all the cakes she'd made for neighbors and church friends and co-workers' children. Martha had believed that everyone deserved to have their birthday acknowledged, that the simple act of marking another year of life was sacred and worthy of celebration. "That sounds wonderful," Frank said, and meant it. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, sharing the bread and the warmth of the bakery, while the snow continued to fall outside. Frank felt something he hadn't experienced in months: peace. For this brief moment, he wasn't a homeless man or a burden or a problem to be solved. He was just Frank, sitting with a kind child, drinking good coffee and eating bread that tasted like hope. But reality had a way of intruding on even the most perfect moments. Through the window, Frank could see other people hurrying past on the sidewalk, their faces turned away from the wind and snow. Soon the afternoon would end, and he'd have to leave this warm sanctuary and return to the cold world outside. Soon, Lila would finish her bread and go home to her grandmother's care, and Frank would be alone again with his hunger and his grief and the long, empty hours until tomorrow. But for now, in this moment, he had been offered something precious, the simple recognition of his humanity, freely given by a child who understood that sharing was just what people did for one another. And for the first time in months, Frank began to remember what it felt like to be worthy of kindness. Frank couldn't stop thinking about the bread. He'd spent the night in the doorway of Henderson's Hardware, huddled under the thin blanket he'd managed to salvage from a church donation box, but sleep had been elusive. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Lila's small hands pushing that bread across the table, heard her clear voice saying, "You can have mine," with such easy generosity that it had nearly broken what was left of his heart. By morning, the snow had stopped falling, but the cold had settled into his bones like an old ache. Frank made his way through his usual routine, washing his face and hands in the gas station restroom, checking the church bulletin board for any day jobs that might be posted, walking the familiar circuit of streets that had become his world. But every step seemed to lead him back toward Miller's bakery, as if some invisible thread was pulling him toward that warm window and the memory of simple kindness. He told himself he was just walking by. He told himself he wouldn't go in again, wouldn't impose on Rose Miller's hospitality, or risk making Lila uncomfortable with his presence. But when 3:30 came, and he saw her small figure settling into her usual chair by the window, he found his feet carrying him toward the door before his mind could object. The bell above the entrance chimed as he stepped inside, and both Rose and Lila looked up. For a moment, Frank stood frozen in the doorway, suddenly uncertain. What if yesterday had been a fluke? What if they'd regretted their kindness in the cold light of a new day? But Lila's face broke into a genuine smile, and she waved him over to her table as if they'd made plans to meet. "Frank, I was hoping you'd come back. I saved you some bread." Sure enough, there was an extra place setting at her small table, complete, with a napkin and a piece of warm bread already waiting. Frank felt his throat tighten with emotion as he approached, overwhelmed once again by this child's thoughtfulness. "I wasn't sure," he began, but Lila shook her head firmly. "Grandma Rose says that when someone needs help, you help them, and you looked like you needed help yesterday. Besides, bread is better when you share it with someone." From behind the counter, Rose Miller watched with an expression Frank couldn't quite read. She was a handsome woman. He realized now that he was paying attention, with kind eyes and capable hands that spoke of a lifetime of hard, honest work. Her graying hair was pulled back in the same practical style as yesterday, and her apron bore the familiar dusting of flour that seemed to be her permanent accessory. "Good afternoon, Mr. Delacroix," she said formally, and Frank appreciated the dignity of being addressed by his proper name. "I was just telling Lila about the time Martha brought me her recipe for apple butter. Must have been 8 or 9 years ago now." Frank's heart clenched at the mention of his wife, but the pain was different today, softer somehow, mixed with gratitude that someone remembered Martha's small kindnesses. "She was always sharing recipes," he said quietly. "Said good food was meant to bring people together." Rose nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "That sounds like Martha. She had a generous spirit." As if sensing the weight of the adult conversation, Lila chimed in with her own observation. "I bet she made really good cookies. You look like someone whose wife made good cookies." The innocent confidence of this statement startled a laugh out of Frank, the first genuine laugh he'd had in months. "She did make good cookies. Chocolate chip were my favorites, but she made these snickerdoodles at Christmas that were something special." "I love snickerdoodles!" Lila exclaimed, bouncing slightly in her chair. "Grandma Rose, do you know how to make snickerdoodles?" "I might be able to figure it out," Rose said carefully, her eyes meeting Frank's across the bakery. "If someone had the recipe." Frank felt a strange flutter of possibility in his chest. Martha's recipe box was one of the few possessions he'd kept, stored carefully in his duffel bag like a treasure he couldn't bear to abandon. The idea of those recipes being used again, of Martha's snickerdoodles bringing joy to another child, felt like a gift he hadn't known he was capable of giving. "I might be able to help with that," he said quietly. For the next hour, Frank found himself drawn into the comfortable rhythm of afternoon conversation. Lila told him about her school. She was in 2nd grade and learning to read chapter books. And about her friend Katie, who had a hamster named Mr. Whiskers. She described her daily routine with the matter-of-fact contentment of a child who felt secure in her place in the world. "I come here every day after school," she explained. "Grandma Rose makes me a snack, and I do my homework at this table. Sometimes other kids come in too, but this is my special spot." Frank learned that Lila had been living with Rose for 2 years now, ever since the car accident that had taken her parents. Rose wasn't actually her grandmother. The title was honorary, born of affection rather than blood, but Lila spoke of her with the easy devotion of a child who had found safety and love in the wake of unimaginable loss. "She reads me stories every night," Lila confided, "and she lets me help in the kitchen on Saturdays. I'm getting really good at measuring flour." As they talked, Frank became aware of the other customers filtering in and out of the bakery. A few glanced at him with curiosity, but most seemed more interested in their own business, picking up loaves for dinner, grabbing coffee for the road, exchanging the casual pleasantries that formed the backbone of small-town social life. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman Lila had mentioned the day before, stopped by their table with a warm smile. "Well, hello there, Lila dear, and you must be Frank. Rose mentioned you were Martha Delacroix's husband." Frank braced himself for pity or judgment, but Mrs. Patterson's expression held only gentle recognition. "Martha and I served on the church, auxiliary together for years. She was a lovely woman, always thinking of others. I was so sorry for your loss." "Thank you," Frank managed, touched by the sincere condolence. "You know," Mrs. Patterson continued thoughtfully, "the church is always looking for help with maintenance work. Father Jim mentioned just last week that the fellowship hall could use some repairs, if you're interested in that sort of thing." The offer was made casually, without fanfare or condescension, but Frank recognized it for what it was, a lifeline, offered with the same matter-of-fact kindness that seemed to characterize this corner of the world he'd stumbled into. "I'll keep that in mind," Frank said carefully. "Thank you." As the afternoon wore on, Frank found himself reluctant to leave the warm sanctuary of the bakery. But evening was approaching, and he could see Rose beginning the process of closing up shop. He knew he couldn't impose indefinitely, couldn't make himself a permanent fixture in Lila's routine, just because her kindness had offered him a brief reprieve from his circumstances. "I should go," he said finally, rising from his chair with genuine regret. "Will you come back tomorrow?" Lila asked, looking up at him with hopeful eyes. Frank glanced toward Rose, uncertain. This was her business, her responsibility, her decision to make. But Rose was studying him with that same unreadable expression she'd worn earlier, as if trying to solve a puzzle whose pieces didn't quite fit together. "The alley behind the shop stays pretty warm," she said finally, her voice carefully neutral. "The heat from the ovens, you know. Sometimes people find it more comfortable than other places." It took Frank a moment to understand what she was offering. A place to sleep. Not inside, which would be too much to ask, but somewhere safe and warm where he wouldn't freeze in the night. Somewhere she could keep an eye on him, make sure he wasn't a threat to the child she'd taken under her wing. "I wouldn't want to be." "Any trouble?" Frank said quietly. "No trouble," Rose replied, her tone suggesting the matter was settled. "Just don't leave any mess, and be gone before the delivery truck comes at 6. Frank nodded, overwhelmed by this unexpected kindness. He'd spent 3 months learning to expect nothing from anyone, to make himself small and invisible and grateful for scraps. But here was this woman, this stranger who remembered his wife, offering him shelter without fanfare or conditions, simply because it was the decent thing to do. "Thank you," he said, the words inadequate for what he was feeling. "Thank Lila," Rose said with a slight smile. "She's the one who insisted we should help." Frank looked down at the little girl who had somehow managed to crack open his frozen heart in the span of 2 days. She was beaming up at him with the satisfied expression of someone who had solved an important problem, and Frank felt something shift inside him, something that had been locked away since Martha's death beginning to thaw. "Thank you, Lila," he said solemnly, "for everything." "You're welcome," she replied with the easy confidence of someone who had never doubted that kindness was the natural order of things. "See you tomorrow, Frank." As he made his way toward the back of the building, Frank touched the folded foreclosure notice in his pocket. But for the first time in months, it didn't feel like a weight dragging him down. Instead, it felt like just another piece of paper, a remnant of a life he'd lost, but not necessarily the end of every story he had left to tell. The thermos appeared on the back step of Miller's Bakery like a small miracle. Frank had woken before dawn, as had become his habit during the months of sleeping rough, and was preparing to leave before the delivery truck arrived as Rose had requested. But there, sitting beside the door with steam still rising from its mouth, was an old blue thermos filled with coffee so hot and strong it made his eyes water with gratitude. A note was tucked underneath, written in Rose's careful handwriting. "Too cold for anyone to start the day without something warm." Frank sat on the step in the grey pre-dawn light, cradling the thermos between his hands and marveling at this simple kindness. When was the last time someone had thought about his comfort enough to leave him coffee? When was the last time anyone had cared whether he was warm or cold, fed or hungry, safe or afraid? Over the next week, the thermos became part of his routine. Every morning it would be there, filled with coffee that tasted like hope and small kindnesses. Sometimes there would be a day-old pastry wrapped in wax paper or a sandwich made from yesterday's bread. Never anything that would suggest charity or pity, just the practical consideration of one human being for another. Frank began to understand that this was Rose's way, this quiet competence that took care of problems without making a fuss about it. She was a woman who noticed things, noticed when the milk delivery was late, noticed when Mrs. Patterson seemed more tired than usual, noticed when a broken man needed help, but was too proud to ask for it directly. The afternoons with Lila became the anchor of Frank's days. She would arrive promptly at 3:30, always with her school bag and her bright red mittens, always ready to share her snack and her endless curiosity about the world. Frank found himself looking forward to her questions, her observations. The way she could find wonder in the most ordinary things. "Why do you think snow is white instead of blue?" she asked one afternoon, watching the flakes drift past the window. "I don't know," Frank admitted. "What do you think?" "Maybe it's white, so we can see it better against the sky," Lila said thoughtfully. "Or maybe white is just the color things turn when they're really, really cold." Frank found himself remembering conversations like this with Martha, the way she'd had of looking at the world with fresh eyes, even after 40 years of marriage. Maybe this was what he'd been missing without knowing it. Not just companionship, but the particular kind of wisdom that came from seeing life through someone else's perspective. The other townspeople were beginning to notice his presence at the bakery, and their reactions varied widely. Some, like Mrs. Patterson and the postal worker Tom Hendricks, greeted him with the casual friendliness they'd have shown any regular customer. Others were more wary, their conversations dropping to whispers when he entered the shop. "That's the man who lost his house," he heard Mrs. Kowalski murmur to her companion one afternoon. "Used to work at the steel plant with my Bob. Sad story, but you have to wonder why he can't find work somewhere." Frank pretended not to hear, but the words stung nonetheless. He'd been wondering the same thing himself, applying for every job he could find, only to be told repeatedly that they were looking for someone younger, someone with more recent experience, someone who didn't carry the weight of loss so visibly in his shoulders. But there were others who surprised him with their quiet acceptance. Pastor Jim McCarthy stopped by one afternoon, a tall man with gentle eyes and graying hair who'd officiated at Martha's funeral. "Frank," he said warmly, extending his hand, "good to see you. How are you holding up?" "Getting by," Frank replied, carefully, uncertain what the pastor's presence might mean. "Mrs. Patterson mentioned you might be interested in some maintenance work at the church. Nothing fancy, just fixing a few things that have been neglected too long. The pay isn't much, but it's honest work if you're interested." Frank felt his chest tighten with something that might have been hope. "I'd be very interested. Good man. Why don't you stop by tomorrow morning around 9? I'll show you what needs doing." Dr. Sarah Chen proved to be another unexpected ally. She was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and the no-nonsense manner of someone accustomed to dealing with both physical ailments and human nature. She'd arrived one afternoon while Frank was sharing Lila's snack, ostensibly to pick up bread for dinner. "You know," she said casually, addressing Frank directly, "the clinic offers basic health services for anyone who needs them. No charge for folks who are between situations. Might be worth stopping by just to make sure everything's running smoothly." Frank knew what she was really saying, that living rough took a toll on the body, that he probably needed medical attention. He couldn't afford that she was offering help without requiring him to admit he needed it. "That's very kind," he said quietly. "Just good sense," Dr. Chen replied briskly. "Can't have people getting sick when it's preventable. Bad for everyone involved." But it was Mayor Thompson who proved to be the most challenging encounter. He arrived one Tuesday afternoon with the purposeful stride of a man on official business, his expensive coat and polished shoes marking him as someone unaccustomed to the everyday struggles that brought people to places like Miller's Bakery. "For something more than convenience, Rose," he said formally, barely acknowledging Frank's presence at Lila's table. "I've been hearing some concerns from business owners about loitering. Wanted to make sure you weren't having any problems with undesirable elements." The words hung in the air like an accusation, and Frank felt his face burn with shame. He started to rise from his chair, ready to leave rather than cause trouble for Rose, but Lila's small hand on his arm stopped him. "Frank's not undesirable," she said with the fierce conviction that only children could muster. "He's my friend. He tells the best stories about when he was young, and he knows all about fixing things." Rose's expression remained carefully neutral, but Frank could see the protective steel that entered her posture when Lila spoke. "Mr. Delacroix is a customer," she said evenly. "A paying customer who's always been respectful and welcome in my establishment." Frank realized with a start that this was true. He had been paying for his coffee and occasional pastries with the few dollars he managed to earn from odd jobs around town. Rose had been careful about that, accepting his money with the same professional courtesy she showed every other customer, preserving his dignity even as she extended her kindness. Mayor Thompson's smile was thin and unconvincing. "Of course, Rose. I'm sure you're handling things appropriately. Just wanted to make sure the town's interests were being protected." After he left, the bakery felt smaller somehow, the warm atmosphere slightly tainted by the reminder that not everyone saw Frank's presence as benign. Frank stared into his coffee cup, wondering if he should find somewhere else to spend his afternoons, somewhere that wouldn't bring complications for the people who'd shown him kindness. "Don't mind him," Rose said quietly, refilling Frank's cup. Without being asked, "Harold Thompson's been looking for problems to solve ever since he got elected. Makes him feel important." "I don't want to cause trouble," Frank said. "You're not causing trouble," Lila said firmly. "Mayor Thompson just doesn't understand about sharing. Some grown-ups forget how to be nice." That evening, as Frank settled into his usual spot in the alley behind the bakery, he found himself thinking about the complicated dynamics of small-town life. He'd been part of this community once, had known these people as neighbors and fellow church members and familiar faces around town, but homelessness had moved him into a different category, made him someone to be managed rather than welcomed, someone whose presence required justification rather than simple acceptance. It was Lila who seemed most immune to these social calculations. To her, Frank was simply Frank, someone who needed a friend and had become one in return. She saved part of her bread for him every day now, not as charity but as the natural expression of a generous heart that had never learned to ration kindness. "Why do some people have houses and some people don't?" she asked one afternoon, the question delivered with her usual directness. Frank considered how to answer, wanting to be honest without burdening her with the complexities of adult failure and systematic inequality. "Sometimes life throws curveballs," he said finally. "Sometimes people get sick or lose their jobs or have things happen that they can't control. And sometimes there aren't enough people helping to catch them when they fall." Lila absorbed this thoughtfully. "But you're not falling anymore," she said with satisfaction. "You're sitting here with me, eating bread. That's not falling." Frank felt something warm unfurl in his chest at her simple logic. She was right, in her innocent way. He wasn't falling anymore. For the first time in months, he had a routine that included more than just survival. He had people who knew his name, who expected to see him, who noticed when he was there, and would notice if he wasn't. It wasn't much by most standards. A cup of coffee in the morning, a shared meal in the afternoon, a warm place to sleep at night. But it was enough to remind him that he was still Frank Delacroix, still someone capable of friendship and conversation, and small contributions to the world around him. And tomorrow, if he was lucky, Lila would be waiting at her table by the window, ready to share her bread and her boundless capacity for finding joy in simple things. Tomorrow, Rose would leave, coffee on the back step, and pretend it was just practical kindness. Tomorrow, he would have another chance to remember what it felt like to be part of something larger than his own loss and fear. For now, that was enough. Frank's work boots had seen better days, but they still fit his feet like old friends. The steel toes were scuffed, and the leather was cracked from years of factory floors and weather. But when Pastor Jim showed him the broken communion rail at St. Michael's, Frank felt his hands remember the weight of tools and the satisfaction of fixing things that were meant to last. "Think you can handle it?" Pastor Jim asked, running his fingers along the loose joints where the rail met the altar steps. Frank knelt to examine the damage, his practiced eye taking in the problem with the kind of automatic assessment that 40 years of steady work had trained into his bones. "Wood still good," he said quietly. "Just needs the joints reset and some proper bracing. Nothing that can't be fixed with the right attention." "That's what I was hoping to hear," Pastor Jim said with relief. "Been putting this off too long. But you know how it is with church budgets." Frank understood. He also understood what the pastor wasn't saying, that this was as much about giving Frank something useful to do as it was about repairing the communion rail. But the motivation didn't matter if the work was real and needed doing, and Frank found himself grateful for the chance to be competent at something again. He started the next morning, arriving at the church with the few tools he'd managed to keep when he'd lost everything else. The work was methodical and peaceful, the kind of careful restoration that required patience more than strength. As he worked, Frank found his mind settling into the familiar rhythm of problem-solving that had once defined his days. Lila discovered him there on the second afternoon, having walked over from the bakery to see what he was doing. She perched on the front pew like a small supervisor, watching him work with the intense curiosity she brought to everything. "Is it hard to fix things?" she asked, swinging her legs from the pew. "Not hard," Frank said, fitting a joint together with careful precision. "Just has to be done right. My grandfather taught me that. Measure twice, cut once, and never hurry important work." "Your grandfather sounds smart." He was. Came here with nothing but willing hands and learned to build houses that are still standing today. Used to say that honest work was its own reward. Lila considered this with the seriousness she brought to all adult wisdom. "I think he would be proud of you," she said finally. The simple confidence of her statement hit Frank unexpectedly hard. Would his grandfather be proud? Would Martha? For months, Frank had felt like a failure, like someone who'd been broken by circumstances beyond his control. But here, in the quiet sanctuary of the church, with his hands busy and useful again, he began to remember that his worth wasn't measured only by what he'd lost. Rose appeared in the doorway as Frank was cleaning up for the day, Lila having gone, to help with the afternoon bread delivery. She moved quietly down the aisle, her footsteps muffled by the worn carpet, and stopped to examine his work with the careful attention of someone who understood quality craftsmanship. "Looks good," she said simply. "Thank you." Frank packed his tools with the methodical care of someone who'd learned to take care of the few possessions he had left. "Pastor Jim says there might be more work if this goes well. I'm sure there will be. Word gets around when someone does good work." They walked back to the bakery together in comfortable silence, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the quiet streets. Frank had noticed that Rose didn't waste words, but when she spoke, it was usually worth listening to. She had the kind of practical wisdom that came from running a small business and raising a child, the ability to see what needed doing and figure out how to do it. "Lila talks about you a lot," Rose said as they reached the bakery. "She's never had a grandfather, you know, biological or otherwise." Frank felt something tighten in his chest. "She's a special girl. You've done well with her. She's easy to love," Rose replied, "but she needs more than just me. Needs to see that there are good men in the world, men who keep their word and care about doing things right." The implication was clear, and Frank felt the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders. Lila had already been abandoned by death once, her parents taken in an instant, her whole world upended before she was old enough to understand a why. Rose was trusting him not to add to that pain, not to be another adult who disappeared from her life without explanation. "I'm not going anywhere," Frank said quietly, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "Good," Rose said, "because I think she's planning to teach you to make cookies next week, Martha's snickerdoodle recipe, if you're willing to share it." Frank thought of the recipe box in his duffel bag, of all those careful notations in Martha's handwriting that represented a lifetime of feeding people and bringing them together around a table. For months, those recipes had been just another loss, another reminder of everything he'd never get back, but maybe they could be something else. A gift that kept giving, a way for Martha's love to continue touching lives even after she was gone. "I'd like that," he said. The next morning brought Frank's first real customer complaint. Mrs. Kowalski was waiting when he arrived at the bakery for his usual coffee, her arms crossed and her expression stern with righteous disapproval. "Rose, I need to speak with you," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. About the situation with this gentleman, Frank felt his face burn with familiar shame, but Rose's expression remained carefully neutral as she poured Mrs. Kowalski's usual order. What situation would that be, Eleanor? You know perfectly well what I'm talking about. People are starting to talk about having transients hanging around, making regular customers uncomfortable. My sister visited from Pittsburgh last week and said she'd never seen anything like it. A respectable business letting homeless people just sit there all afternoon. Frank started to stand, ready to leave rather than cause Rose any more trouble, but she caught his eye and shook her head. Slightly. Mr. Delacroix is a paying customer, Rose said calmly. He's never caused any problems, never been anything but respectful and polite. I'm not sure what your concern is. My concern is for the reputation of this establishment and the safety of that child you're responsible for. Everyone knows homeless people have problems, drinking, drugs, mental illness. You can't be too careful these days. The words hit Frank like physical blows, each accusation a confirmation of everything he'd feared people were thinking about him. He'd never been a drinking man beyond the occasional beer after work, had never touched drugs in his life, and his only mental illness was the grief that came from losing everything he'd ever cared about. But he understood how he must look to people like Mrs. Kowalski, shabby, displaced, a walking reminder of how quickly a respectable life could fall apart. It was Lila who broke the tense silence, appearing at Frank's elbow with her school bag and her bright mittens, apparently oblivious to the adult drama playing out above her head. "Hi, Frank," she said cheerfully. "Guess what we learned in school today? We learned about the pioneers and how they helped each other build barns and share food when someone was in trouble. Mrs. Anderson says that's called community spirit." The innocent timing of her words created a moment of crystalline clarity in the bakery. Here was this child, this living example of the community spirit she'd just described, standing beside a man who'd been reduced to depending on that same spirit for survival. And here was Mrs. Kowalski, a pillar of the church and long-time resident, arguing against the very values she claimed to uphold. Rose's smile was gentle but unmistakable in its meaning. "That sounds like a very important lesson, sweetheart. Community spirit is what makes a place worth living in." Mrs. Kowalski left without another word, but Frank could see in her stiff posture that this wasn't over. Word would spread, opinions would harden, and pressure would build for Rose to choose between her business reputation and her willingness to shelter someone who didn't fit the town's comfortable definition of acceptable. "I should go," Frank said quietly, after Lila had settled at their usual table. "I don't want to cause problems for you." "The only problem," Rose said firmly, "is people who've forgotten what it means to be neighbors. You're not going anywhere. Frank Delacroix, this is your place now, same as anyone else's." As Frank sat down across from Lila, accepting the bread she'd already prepared for him, he felt the full weight of what Rose was offering. Not just shelter or kindness, but belonging. The chance to be part of something again, to matter to people who would notice if he was gone. It was a gift more precious than anything he could have imagined, and more fragile than anything he'd ever been trusted to protect. Dr. Sarah Chen's medical bag was an old-fashioned black leather satchel that had seen decades of house calls and emergency visits. Its worn surface speaking of countless moments when professional skill had met human need. She arrived at the bakery on a Thursday afternoon with the purposeful efficiency that characterized everything about her, but her manner was gentle as she approached Frank's table where he sat with Lila, both of them working on a jigsaw puzzle she'd brought from home. "Mr. Delacroix," Dr. Chen said, settling into the chair beside them without fanfare. "I was hoping I might have a word with you. Nothing urgent, just routine health maintenance that we should probably address." Frank felt his shoulders tense automatically. He hadn't seen a doctor since Martha's final hospitalization, couldn't afford to see one, and had been managing his various aches and pains with the stoic resignation of someone who'd learned to expect very little from life. "I appreciate the offer," he said carefully, "but I'm not sure I can—" "Community health program," Dr. Chen interrupted smoothly. funded by a state grant to provide basic care for residents who are between insurance situations. No cost to you, and it helps me meet my program requirements. Everyone wins." Lila looked up from the puzzle with interest. "Are you going to check if Frank is healthy? I had a checkup last month and Dr. Chen said I was growing exactly right." "That's the plan," Dr. Chen said with a smile. "Though I suspect Frank has been taking pretty good care of himself, all things considered." Frank wasn't sure that was true. The months of irregular meals and sleeping rough had taken their toll, and he'd been ignoring a persistent cough and the stiffness in his joints that seemed to worsen with each cold night. But Dr. Chen's matter-of-fact approach made it hard to refuse what was clearly meant as kindness rather than charity. "I suppose that would be all right," he said finally. "Excellent. Why don't you stop by the clinic tomorrow morning? We'll get everything sorted out." Pastor Jim arrived soon after Dr. Chen left, his usually cheerful demeanor carrying an undercurrent of concern that put Frank immediately on alert. He accepted Rose's offer of coffee and settled at their table with the careful politeness of someone who had difficult news to deliver. "Frank, I wanted to talk to you about the communion rail project," he began. "Your work has been excellent, better than I hoped for, honestly. The church board is impressed." Frank waited for the "but" that he could hear coming in the pastor's tone. "The thing is," Pastor Jim continued, "there's been some discussion about expanding the project. The fellowship hall needs significant work, and there's talk of updating the kitchen facilities. It could mean steady employment for several months, maybe longer." "That sounds like good news," Frank said cautiously. "It is good news. But there's also been some concern expressed by certain board members about the appropriateness of having someone in your current situation working so extensively in the church facilities." Frank felt the familiar burn of shame rise in his chest. "I understand," he said quietly. "I don't think you do," Pastor Jim said firmly. "Because I'm not here to tell you the work is off. I'm here to tell you that we're going to need to address the housing situation if we want this to work long term. The church can't officially employ someone who doesn't have a permanent address." Lila had been listening to this conversation with the intense attention she paid to all adult discussions that seemed important. And now she looked up from her puzzle with a frown of concentration. "Why does it matter where Frank sleeps?" she asked. "He does good work whether he has a house or not." "You're absolutely right," Pastor Jim said seriously. "It shouldn't matter. But sometimes rules exist that don't make much sense when you apply them to real people in real situations." "That's stupid," Lila declared with the moral clarity that only children possessed. "Yes," Pastor Jim agreed, "sometimes it is." Frank appreciated the pastor's honesty, but the reality of the situation was clear enough. Without a permanent address, he couldn't be officially employed by the church. Without employment, he couldn't afford housing. It was the kind of circular trap that homelessness created, where every solution required resources that the problem itself had eliminated. "I'll figure something out," Frank said, though he had no idea what that might be. "Actually," Rose said from behind the counter, her voice carrying a note of decision that made everyone turn toward her. "I've been thinking about the apartment upstairs. It's been empty for 2 years now, ever since Mrs. Henderson moved to the assisted living facility, just sitting there collecting dust." Frank felt his heart skip a beat. The apartment above the bakery had been a fixture of downtown Millfield for as long as he could remember, a small but comfortable space that had housed a succession of tenants over the years. "Rose," he said carefully, "I couldn't afford building maintenance," Rose interrupted, her tone brooking no argument. "The place needs someone to keep an eye on things, do basic repairs, maybe help with the early morning baking when business picks up. Room and board in exchange for work. Seems like a fair arrangement to me." Frank stared at her, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was offering. Not just shelter, but dignity. The chance to pay his way through honest work, to be a contributing member of the community rather than someone dependent on charity. "I don't know what to say," he managed. "Say yes," Lila piped up helpfully. "Then you'll live right here and we can have breakfast together every morning." Frank looked around the table at these people who had somehow become the foundation of his new life. Pastor Jim, with his genuine faith in human potential, Dr. Chen with her practical compassion, Rose with her quiet strength, and Lila with her absolute certainty that kindness was the natural order of things. "Yes," he said simply. "Yes, I'd like that very much." Rose nodded with satisfaction, as if she'd just solved a problem that had been bothering her for some time. "Good. We'll get you settled this weekend. The place is furnished and the utilities are already connected. Just needs a good cleaning and someone to bring it back to life." Pastor Jim raised his coffee cup in a mock toast. "To new beginnings," he said. "To community spirit," Lila added solemnly, raising her milk glass. Frank felt tears threaten as he lifted his own cup, but they were tears of gratitude rather than grief. For the first time since Martha's death, he had a home. Not just a place to sleep, but a real home with people who cared whether he was safe and warm and fed. It wasn't the same as what he'd lost, could never replace the life he'd built with Martha over 4 decades of marriage, but it was something new and precious in its own right, a second chance he'd never expected to receive. That evening, as Frank climbed the narrow stairs to what would be his new apartment, he touched the foreclosure notice in his pocket one last time. Then, with a sense of ceremony that felt important, he pulled it out and dropped it in the trash can at the bottom of the stairs. He wouldn't need it anymore. The past was still part of him, would always be part of him, but it no longer defined the boundaries of what was possible. Tomorrow he would wake up in his own bed, in his own home, surrounded by people who had chosen to include him in their lives, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, tomorrow felt like something to look forward to, rather than simply another day to survive. Martha's letter was hidden in the inside pocket of Frank's winter coat, tucked so deeply into the lining that Rose almost missed it when she insisted on washing the garment before he moved into his new apartment. "What's this?" she asked, holding up the envelope that had worked its way loose from its hiding place. The paper was soft with age and handling, Frank's name written across the front in Martha's careful script. Frank stared at the letter as if he were seeing a ghost. He'd forgotten it was there, forgotten that Martha had pressed it into his hands. During one of her last lucid moments in the hospital, forgotten her whispered instructions to read it when the time was right. In the chaos of grief and loss that had followed her death, the letter had simply disappeared into the depths of his coat pocket, buried under layers of more immediate concerns. "I didn't know," he said quietly, taking the envelope with hands that trembled slightly. "I'd forgotten she'd given me this." Rose stepped back, giving him privacy, but Frank found himself unable to open the letter alone. After months of sharing his days with these people who'd become his unlikely family, the idea of facing Martha's final words in isolation felt wrong. "Would you—" he began, then stopped, uncertain how to ask for what he needed. "Of course," Rose said gently, settling into the chair across from him. Lila, who had been helping sort through Frank's few belongings, moved closer with the intuitive understanding that children sometimes possessed about important moments. Frank's fingers were clumsy as he opened the envelope, the seal brittle with age. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered with Martha's handwriting, the words slightly shaky from the medication, but still unmistakably hers. "My dearest Frank," he read aloud, his voice thick with emotion. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're probably feeling lost and broken and wondering how you're supposed to keep going without me. I know you, my love. I know you're blaming yourself for not being able to save me, not being able to keep our life together from falling apart." Frank had to stop reading, overwhelmed by how perfectly Martha had understood what his grief would look like, how precisely she'd anticipated the self-recrimination and despair that had consumed him in the months since her death. "But I need you to listen to me now, Frank Delacroix, because this is important. Our love story isn't ending just because I'm not there to live it with you anymore. Love doesn't work that way. Real love grows and spreads and finds new ways to touch the world, even after the people who started it are gone. Rose reached across the table and squeezed Frank's free hand, offering silent support as he continued reading. I have a confession to make. During my treatments, when you thought I was just resting between appointments, I was volunteering at the children's shelter on Elm Street. I know you would have worried, would have insisted I save my strength for fighting the cancer. But I needed to do something useful with whatever time I had left. Frank felt a jolt of surprise. He'd never known about Martha's volunteer work, had assumed she spent those hours sleeping or reading or simply gathering strength for the next round of treatment. There's a little girl there named Lila Morrison, 7 years old, lost her parents in a car accident last year. She's been moved between foster homes, and she's scared and angry and convinced that everyone she loves will leave her eventually. But she's also brave and kind and so hungry for someone to believe in her that it breaks my heart. Lila gasped, softly at hearing her own name, her eyes wide with wonder at this connection she'd never suspected. I've been reading to her twice a week, and she started to trust me a little. She told me she dreams about having a grandfather who would teach her things and tell her stories and never go away. I told her that somewhere out there, there's a man who needs a little girl to remind him that the world is still full of wonder and hope. Frank's vision blurred as the implications of Martha's words began to sink in. This wasn't coincidence. His meeting with Lila hadn't been random chance, but the fulfillment of a plan Martha had been working on even as her own life was ending. I know this might sound crazy, but I believe in signs, Frank. I believe that when we love someone enough, we can find ways to keep taking care of them even after we're gone. If you're reading this letter, it means you've found your way to Lila, somehow, and she's found her way to you. Rose was crying quietly now, and even Lila seemed to understand that they were witnessing something extraordinary, the revelation of a love so deep and selfless that it had reached across the boundary, between life and death to bring healing to two broken hearts. There's something else you need to know. Remember that life insurance policy we took out when we first got married? The small one we always said we'd cash out if we needed money for emergencies? I never told you, but the payments have been automatically deducted from our checking account all these years. With my death benefit, there should be about $15,000. Frank stared at the letter in shock. $15,000, enough to start over, enough to make a real difference, enough to do something meaningful with the second chance he'd been given. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking that money should go toward paying off debts or getting yourself back on your feet. But I have a different idea. That shelter where I met Lila, it's struggling. They don't have enough beds, enough staff, enough resources to help all the children who need safe places to heal. What if that money could be the beginning of something bigger? What if our love story could help other love stories begin? Frank had to set the letter down for a moment, overwhelmed by the magnitude of Martha's vision. Even in her final weeks, battling cancer and facing her own mortality, she'd been thinking about how to transform their personal tragedy into something that could serve others. I'm not telling you what to do, my darling. I never did that when I was alive, and I won't start now. But I want you to know that you have choices, that there are still ways for you to make a difference in this world. And if you decide to use that money to help children like Lila find safe harbors in the storm, well, I can't think of a better memorial to our 42 years together. Lila had moved closer during the reading, and now she slipped her small hand into Frank's free one, offering comfort with the same natural generosity that had characterized their friendship from the beginning. The letter ends here, but the story doesn't, Frank read, his voice barely above a whisper. Love never really ends, Frank. It just finds new ways to grow. I'll be watching, and I'll be so proud of whatever you choose to do next. All my love always and forever, Martha. The bakery was silent except for the gentle sound of Rose's quiet crying and the distant hum of the ovens in the kitchen. Frank folded the letter carefully, his mind reeling with the implications of what he'd just learned. "She knew," Lila said softly. "She knew we needed each other." Frank looked down at this remarkable child who had somehow been chosen for him by a wife, who'd loved him enough to keep taking care of him even after death had separated them. The money Martha had mentioned would indeed be enough to make a real difference, enough to fund a shelter, to provide safe spaces for children who'd lost everything, to create something lasting and beautiful from the ashes of his old life. "What are you going to do?" Rose asked gently. Frank thought about the apartment upstairs that would be his new home, about the work waiting for him at the church, about the community that had embraced him when he'd had nothing left to offer but his broken heart and his willingness to keep going. He thought about Martha's dream of love that grew and spread and found new ways to touch the world. Most of all, he thought about Lila, about all the other children like her who needed someone to believe in them, who needed safe places to heal and grow and learn to trust again. "I think," Frank said slowly, "I need to make some phone calls. I think Martha might have had the right idea about what our love story should look like next." As he spoke, Frank felt something shift inside him, a sense of purpose returning, a recognition that his life wasn't over, but transformed. Martha's final gift hadn't just been money or even the revelation of his connection to Lila. It had been the reminder that even in loss, even in grief, even in the darkest moments of despair, love could still find ways to create hope. And perhaps, if he was very careful and very intentional about what he did next, their love story really could become the beginning of many others. The community board at Miller's Bakery had started as Rose's simple way to help neighbors connect, a cork board, where people could post requests for babysitting, advertise yard sales, or offer rides to church. But in the weeks following Frank's discovery of Martha's letter, it had transformed into something much more significant, the visible symbol of a community learning to care for its most vulnerable members. Frank stood before the board on a crisp Monday morning, studying the collection of notes and offers that had accumulated over the weekend. Mrs. Patterson had posted a card offering free piano lessons for any child who wanted to learn. Dr. Chen had pinned up information about a new mental health support group. Tom Hendricks from the hardware store had written a simple note. "Need help with home repairs? Ask Tom. No job too small." But it was the newest addition that caught Frank's attention, a formal notice from the town council announcing a public hearing scheduled for the following Thursday. The subject line read, "Proposed zoning variance for transitional housing facility." "Second thoughts?" Rose asked, appearing at his elbow with 2 cups of coffee and the knowing look of someone who'd watched him stare at that notice for the past 10 minutes. "Not second thoughts," Frank said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Just wondering if I'm crazy to think this could actually work." The plan that had emerged from Martha's letter was ambitious by any measure. Frank wanted to use the insurance money as seed funding to convert the unused upper floors of several downtown buildings into temporary housing for homeless individuals and families. The facility would be more than just shelter. It would include job training programs, childcare services, and the kind of comprehensive support that could help people rebuild their lives rather than simply survive them. Rose had offered the unused storage space above her bakery as the program's first location. Pastor Jim had convinced the church board to donate the old rectory building that had been sitting empty for 5 years. Dr. Chen had agreed to provide medical services, and even Tom Hendricks had volunteered to teach basic construction skills to residents who wanted to learn a trade. But good intentions and volunteer enthusiasm could only go so far. To make the program official, to access additional funding and meet state regulations, Frank needed the town council's approval for a zoning variance that would allow transitional housing in the downtown commercial district. "You're not crazy," Rose said firmly. Ambitious, maybe. Optimistic, definitely, but not crazy. Lila burst through the bakery door at that moment, her cheeks flushed from the cold and her backpack bouncing with excitement. She'd thrown herself into the shelter project with the same wholehearted enthusiasm she brought to everything, designing welcome signs and volunteering to help organize donated clothes. Frank, guess what happened at school today? She didn't wait for an answer before continuing. Mrs. Anderson told our whole class about the shelter project, and everyone wants to help. Tommy's mom said she has boxes of clothes her kids outgrew. And Sarah's dad knows about fixing computers, and even mean Mr. Kowalski said he might donate some old furniture. Frank felt a warm surge of hope at Lila's report. The project had been gaining momentum throughout the community, drawing support from unexpected quarters as word spread about what they were trying to accomplish. But he also knew that enthusiasm from children and volunteers wouldn't be enough to sway the town council if they decided the project posed too great a risk to property values or public safety. That's wonderful, sweetheart, Frank said, ruffling her hair. Every bit of help matters. Are you nervous about the meeting? Lila asked with her usual directness. You look nervous. Frank considered how to answer honestly without burdening her with his doubts. The truth was, he was terrified. Public speaking had never been his strength, and the thought of standing before the town council to defend a project that meant everything to him made his stomach clench with anxiety. A little nervous, he admitted. It's important to get this right. You'll do great, Lila said with absolute confidence. You just have to tell them about how people helped you when you needed it, and how now you want to help other people. That's easy. If only it were that simple, Frank thought. But Mayor Thompson had already made it clear that he had reservations about the project, and Frank suspected there would be significant opposition from business owners who worried about the impact on their establishments. Over the next few days, Frank threw himself into preparation with the same methodical attention to detail he'd once brought to his work at the steel mill. He researched similar programs in other towns, gathering statistics on success rates and economic impact. He practiced his presentation until he could deliver it without notes, incorporating the stories of people he'd met at the soup kitchen who could benefit from transitional housing services. Pastor Jim proved invaluable in helping him anticipate objections and craft responses that addressed practical concerns without sacrificing the human element that made the project meaningful. Remember, the pastor advised during one of their practice sessions, you're not just asking for permission to house homeless people. You're proposing a solution to a problem the community already has. Frame it that way. Dr. Chen contributed medical data showing how stable housing improved health outcomes and reduced emergency room visits. Rose provided information about how the project could boost downtown foot traffic and create jobs. Even Mrs. Patterson, who had initially been skeptical, offered to speak about the importance of giving people second chances. But it was Lila who insisted on the most crucial preparation of all. You need to visit Martha's grave, she announced one afternoon, with the matter-of-fact certainty that adults had learned to respect when she made pronouncements about important matters. Frank hadn't been to the cemetery since the funeral. Couldn't bear the thought of seeing Martha's name carved in stone, the final proof that she was really gone. But Lila's suggestion felt right in a way he couldn't explain. They went together on Wednesday evening, just as the sun was setting and the autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves. Martha's grave was in the older section of Millfield Cemetery, beneath a massive oak tree that would have pleased her with its promise of shade and seasonal beauty. Frank knelt beside the headstone, running his fingers over the familiar letters of her name, and felt the familiar ache of lost tempered now by something that might have been peace. I found your letter, he said quietly, as if she were sitting beside him on the stone bench they'd shared for so many years of marriage. I found Lila, just like you planned, and now we're trying to do something with the money, something that would make you proud. Lila sat cross-legged in the grass nearby, respectfully quiet but clearly listening to every word. "I'm scared I'll mess it up," Frank continued. "Scared I'll say the wrong thing tomorrow night, or that people won't understand what we're trying to do. I was never good at talking to crowds, Martha. That was always your gift, not mine." The evening breeze rustled through the oak leaves above them, and Frank felt something settle in his chest. Not Martha's presence exactly, but the echo of her unwavering faith in his ability to do what needed doing. "But I guess that's not the point, is it?" he said softly. "The point is to try, to show up and do the work and trust that love really can find ways to keep growing." When they finally walked back to the bakery in the gathering darkness, Frank felt ready for whatever tomorrow would bring. Not confident necessarily, but ready. Ready to honor Martha's memory, ready to fight for Lila and all the other children who needed safe places to heal, ready to prove that a broken man could still find ways to help mend a broken world. "She's proud of you," Lila said as they reached the bakery door. "I can tell." Frank looked down at this remarkable child who had somehow become the bridge between his old life and his new one, between grief and hope, between the man he'd been and the man he was still becoming. "Thank you," he said simply, meaning more than she could possibly understand. Tomorrow night he would stand before the town council and ask them to believe in second chances. He would ask them to see past their fears and practical concerns to the fundamental truth that Lila had recognized from the very beginning, that everyone deserved to be treated with dignity, that sharing was just what people did for one another, that love really could find ways to keep growing even in the darkest of circumstances. And if he was very lucky, if he found the right words and touched the right hearts, maybe Martha's dream of love that spread and grew and found new ways to heal the world might become reality. Martha's silver cross had been her confirmation gift from her grandmother, a simple piece of jewelry that she'd worn every day of their marriage. Frank had saved it from everything else they'd lost, keeping it wrapped in tissue paper in his duffel bag like a talisman against complete despair. Now, as he stood outside the town hall on Thursday evening, he pressed the small cross into Lila's palm with hands that trembled slightly from nerves and cold. "This was very important to Martha," he said quietly. "I want you to have it, to remember that some kinds of love never really end." Lila closed her small fingers around the cross, her expression solemn with the weight of receiving such a precious gift. "Are you sure?" she asked. "I'm sure," Frank said. "Martha would want you to have it. She would want you to know that you're loved no matter what happens tonight." The town hall was already crowded when they entered, the meeting room filled with familiar faces from around Millfield. Frank saw supporters scattered throughout the audience, Rose and Pastor Jim in the front row, Dr. Chen near the middle, Mrs. Patterson with several other church ladies clustered together like a benevolent conspiracy. But he also recognized potential opposition. Mayor Thompson's stern expression, several business owners who'd expressed concerns about property values, and Mrs. Kowalski with a group of residents who'd been vocal about their worries regarding public safety. Frank made his way to the front of the room where a small table had been set up for speakers, his presentation notes carefully organized in a folder that Rose had insisted he carry for confidence, even if you don't need them. His mouth felt dry and his heart was beating with the irregular rhythm of someone facing a test that would determine everything that came next. Mayor Thompson called the meeting to order with the efficient formality of local government, working through routine business before arriving at the main event. When Frank's name was called, the room fell silent in the way that indicated everyone present understood the significance of what was about to happen. Frank stood slowly, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him, and approached the podium with the careful dignity of a man who'd learned to carry himself with pride even when he had nothing left to be proud of. "My name is Frank Delacroix," he began, his voice steadier than he'd expected. 6 months ago, most of you knew me as Martha's husband, as someone who worked at the steel mill for 40 years and minded his own business, and never imagined he'd be standing here asking for help. He paused, looking out at the sea of faces, some sympathetic, some skeptical, all waiting to see what he would say next. 6 months ago, I lost everything I thought defined me. My wife to cancer, my home to medical bills, my place in this community to circumstances I couldn't control. I learned what it feels like to be invisible, to walk down streets where I'd lived my whole life and have people look right through me as if I'd never existed. Frank saw several people in the audience shift uncomfortably, recognizing themselves in his description. But I also learned something else. I learned that this community, our community, is full of people who remember what it means to be neighbors. People like Rose Miller, who offered me shelter when I had nowhere else to go. People like Pastor Jim, who gave me work when no one else would hire me. People like Dr. Chen, who made sure I stayed healthy when I couldn't afford to see a doctor. He gestured toward Lila, who was sitting in the front row, clutching Martha's cross and watching him with absolute faith in her bright eyes. Most of all, I learned about kindness from a 7-year-old girl who looked at a broken man and saw someone worth sharing her bread with. Lila taught me that sharing isn't charity. It's just what people do for each other when they remember that we're all part of the same human family. Frank felt his voice growing stronger as he spoke, the words coming more easily now that he was talking about the people and experiences that had saved his life. The program I'm proposing tonight isn't about helping homeless people, he continued. It's about helping our neighbors, our fellow community members who've fallen on hard times and need a hand getting back on their feet. It's about creating a place where families can rebuild their lives with dignity, where children can have stable homes while their parents find work, where people like me can discover that losing everything doesn't have to mean losing hope. He saw Mayor Thompson leaning forward, his expression still skeptical, but perhaps slightly more engaged than it had been at the beginning. "We're not asking for handouts," Frank said, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who'd lived every word he was speaking. "We're proposing a partnership. The people who use this program will contribute to the community through work programs, volunteer services, and the simple recognition that everyone has something valuable to offer if given the chance." From the audience, he heard a few murmurs of what might have been approval, but he also saw several faces that remained unconvinced, concerned about the practical implications of what he was proposing. "I know some of you are worried about property, values, about safety, about what kind of people this program might attract to our town," Frank acknowledged. "Those are legitimate concerns, and I respect them. But I want you to consider this. Every person who could benefit from this program is someone's father, someone's mother, someone's child. They're not strangers or outsiders. They're us, just at a different point in their journey." Frank paused again, gathering himself for the most important part of his presentation, the part that would either win hearts or confirm his critics' worst fears about his judgment and qualifications to lead such an initiative. The voting ballot that would determine the fate of Martha's place sat on the council table like a small rectangle of democratic possibility. 5 simple boxes that would decide whether Frank's vision of healing and hope could become reality. "Before we vote," Mayor Thompson said, his tone suggesting he was far from convinced, "I think we need to hear from other community members about this proposal. This is, after all, a decision that affects everyone in Millfield." Frank felt his heart sink as Mrs. Kowalski rose from her seat, her expression set with the righteous determination of someone prepared to voice difficult truths that others might be too polite to mention. "I appreciate Mr. Delacroix's passion," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed room, "and I certainly sympathize with his situation. But we have to think practically about what this program would mean for our town." She gestured toward the business owners scattered throughout the audience. "Property values, public safety, the character of our downtown district, these aren't trivial concerns." Millfield has worked hard to maintain its reputation as a family-friendly community, and I worry about the message we'd be sending by essentially inviting transients to set up permanent residence in our commercial centre. Frank felt the familiar sting of that word, transients, with its implication that homeless people were somehow less than fully human, less deserving of consideration and care. But before he could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "With respect, Eleanor," said Pastor Jim, rising from his seat with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to speaking moral truth to uncomfortable audiences, "I think we need to be very careful about how we talk about our neighbors in need." He turned to address the room at large, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone who'd spent decades helping people navigate difficult ethical questions. The Good Samaritan didn't stop to consider property values before helping the man who'd been beaten and left for dead, Pastor Jim continued. He saw someone in need and responded with compassion. That's what we're being asked to do tonight. Not to solve homelessness everywhere, but to help our own community members when they need it most. Dr. Chen stood next, her medical bag at her feet and her expression carrying the practical authority of someone who'd seen the real consequences of social policies on human health. From a public health perspective, she said, stable housing is one of the most effective interventions we can provide. People with secure shelter have better health outcomes, their children perform better in school, and they're more likely to find and maintain employment. This program isn't just morally right, it's economically smart. But the opposition wasn't finished. A man Frank recognized as the owner of the hardware store raised his hand to speak. "That all sounds fine in theory," he said. "But what about the practical concerns? Who's going to supervise these people? How do we know they won't cause problems? For other downtown businesses, how do we protect our customers and our investments?" It was then that something unexpected happened. A voice Frank didn't recognize spoke up from the back of the room. A younger man with calloused hands and the bearing of someone who worked with his hands for a living. "I was homeless for 8 months in Detroit before I came here," the man said, his voice steady despite the obvious difficulty of making such a public admission. "Lost my job when the plant closed, couldn't make rent, ended up sleeping in my car until someone broke the windows and stole everything I had left." The room had gone completely silent, everyone straining to hear this unexpected testimony. "What saved me wasn't charity," the man continued. "It was a program just like what Mr. Delacroix is proposing, a place that treated me like a human being instead of a problem to be managed. They gave me somewhere safe to sleep while I looked for work, helped me get the training I needed for a new career, and most importantly, they reminded me that I still had value even when I'd lost everything else." He gestured toward Frank with something that looked like recognition and respect. "That man up there knows what it feels like to have your whole world fall apart through no fault of your own. If anyone can run a program like this with dignity and compassion, it's someone who's been where these people are." Frank felt tears threaten as this stranger, this fellow survivor, offered support he'd never expected to receive. But the most powerful moment was yet to come. Lila stood up in the front row, Martha's silver cross clutched in her small hand, and in her clear, confident voice that had first offered to share her bread with a desperate stranger, she addressed the room full of adults. "Excuse me," she said politely, and the entire assembly turned toward this small girl who somehow commanded attention without raising her voice. "I just wanted to say something about Frank." Mayor Thompson looked uncertain about allowing a child to address the council, but the room was so quiet that interrupting seemed impossible. "Frank was really sad when I first met him," Lila continued, with the matter-of-fact honesty that made her observations so powerful. "He didn't have anywhere to live, and he was hungry, and nobody was paying attention to him. But he was still a good person. He was still someone's husband who missed his wife, and someone who knew how to fix things and tell stories and be kind, even when he was hurting." She held up Martha's cross so everyone could see it, This belonged to Frank's wife, and he gave it to me tonight because he wanted me to know that love doesn't stop just because someone dies. That's what this shelter is about. Love that doesn't stop. Love that keeps helping people even when it's hard. The simple eloquence of her words seemed to settle over the room like a benediction, cutting through all the practical concerns and political calculations to the essential human truth at the heart of Frank's proposal. I think, Lila concluded, that if we don't help people when they need it, we forget how to be good neighbors, and I don't want to forget that. She sat down as suddenly as she'd stood up, leaving the room in a silence that felt different from before, softer, more thoughtful, charged with the possibility that a child's wisdom might be exactly what was needed to remind adults of their better angels. Mayor Thompson cleared his throat, visibly moved despite his earlier skepticism. "Well," he said, "I think we've heard enough testimony. Council members, are you ready to vote?" Frank watched as each council member marked their ballot, his heart hammering against his ribs as he tried to read their expressions for clues about how they'd decided. When the ballots were collected and counted, Mayor Thompson stood to announce the results with the formal gravity appropriate to such a moment. The motion to approve the zoning variance for the Martha's Place transitional housing program, he said, pausing for what felt like an eternity, passes by a vote of 3-2. The room erupted in applause and cheers, but Frank barely heard the celebration over the roar of blood in his ears. 3-2. It had been close, closer than he'd hoped, but it was enough. Martha's Place would become a reality, as people crowded around to offer congratulations and volunteer their support. Frank felt Lila slip her hand into his and squeeze gently. He looked down at her bright, triumphant face and saw Martha's cross gleaming against her sweater. "We did it," she said simply, as if there had never been any doubt about the outcome. "Yes," Frank said, his voice thick with emotion and gratitude, and the overwhelming recognition that love really did find ways to keep growing. "We did it." The guest book at Martha's Place was a simple composition notebook with a blue cover that had cost less than $3 at the drugstore, but Frank treated it like the precious document it had become, a record of lives restored, dignity reclaimed, and hope rebuilt one signature at a time. 6 months after the town council vote, the shelter was thriving in ways that exceeded even Frank's most optimistic projections. The converted space above Miller's Bakery housed 4 families at any given time, while the old rectory building provided transitional apartments for individuals who were ready for more independence but still needed support services. Maria Gonzalez and children, November 15th. Frank read aloud from the most recent entry as Lila perched on the edge of his desk, her legs swinging with the easy contentment of someone who felt perfectly at home in this world they'd created. Together. Came to us after losing her job and apartment. Now has position at the medical clinic and saved enough for security deposit on permanent housing. Maria's story had become one of Frank's favorites to tell. A young mother with 2 small children who'd arrived at Martha's Place exhausted and discouraged after weeks of sleeping in her car. Dr. Chen had helped her get the medical training. She needed to work as a clinic assistant, while the shelter's childcare program had allowed her to attend classes without worrying about her children's safety. She was really scared when she first got here, Lila observed, having appointed herself the unofficial greeter for new residents. But now she smiles all the time, and her little boy isn't sad anymore. Frank nodded, remembering Maria's transformation. From the frightened woman who'd signed the guest book with shaking hands to the confident professional who'd moved into her own apartment just last week. It was a transformation he'd witnessed dozens of times now, the gradual rebuilding of self-worth that happened when people were treated with dignity rather than pity. The program had evolved far beyond his original vision. What had started as simple emergency housing had grown into a comprehensive support system that included job training, childcare, counseling services, and educational programs. Rose's Bakery had become the unofficial community center, with residents and volunteers gathering there for everything from literacy classes to support group meetings. Frank's daily routine now began before dawn, when he'd join Rose in the bakery kitchen to prepare breakfast for the shelter residents. The work was satisfying in a way his old job at the steel mill had never been, not just because it paid the bills, but because it served a purpose larger than himself. Morning meeting in 10 minutes, Rose called from the kitchen doorway, flour dusting her apron as usual. She'd thrown herself into the shelter work with the same practical competence she brought to everything else, becoming Frank's unofficial co-director and the person residents turned to when they needed someone who understood both compassion and accountability. The morning meetings were Frank's favorite part of each day, a chance to check in with current residents, celebrate successes, address challenges, and remind everyone that they were part of a community that cared about their well-being. Today's group included 2 families and 3 individuals, ranging from teenage mother Jennifer, who was working toward her GED, to retired veteran Robert, who'd lost his disability benefits to bureaucratic confusion. "Before we start," Frank said, as they gathered in the bakery's back room, "I want to share some good news. The state has approved our application for additional funding, which means we can expand the job training program and hire a full-time social worker." The announcement was met with applause and smiles, but Frank could see the deeper significance in their faces, the recognition that someone believed in this program enough to invest in its future, that they weren't just a temporary charity case, but part of something sustainable and growing. After the meeting, Frank walked through downtown Millfield with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd found his purpose in life. The town had changed in subtle but meaningful ways since Martha's Place opened. Other businesses had begun participating in the job training program, offering internships and entry-level positions to residents who were ready to work. The library had started hosting financial literacy classes. Even Mrs. Kowalski had grudgingly admitted that the program seemed to be working out better than expected. Frank's route took him past the house on Maple Street, where he and Martha had lived for 37 years. A young family lived there now, and he could see children's toys scattered across the front yard and laundry hanging on the line Martha had installed behind the kitchen. It didn't hurt to see it anymore. If anything, he felt glad that the house was once again filled with the sounds of family life and daily routines. "Frank," Lila's voice interrupted his thoughts as she ran toward him from the direction of the school, her backpack bouncing and her face bright with excitement. At 8.5 now, she'd grown taller and more confident, but she still saved part of her afternoon snack to share with him, and she still greeted him each day as if his presence in her life was the most natural thing in the world. "Guess what we're learning about in school," she said, falling into step beside him as they headed back toward the bakery. "Community helpers. Mrs. Anderson says you're a community helper because you help people find homes and jobs and remember how to be happy." Frank felt a familiar warmth spread through his chest at her words. Community helper. It was a simple designation, the kind of thing second graders learned about police officers and firefighters and teachers, but it captured something important about the role he'd found for himself in this new life. "That's a nice way to put it," he said. "Are you happy, Frank?" Lila asked, with the directness that never failed to surprise him, even after all these months of friendship. "I mean really happy, not just pretending to be okay?" Frank considered the question seriously, as he always did when Lila asked him something important. Was he happy? The grief over losing Martha would always be part of him, woven into the fabric of who he was in ways that couldn't be changed or healed. But underneath that permanent sadness was something else, a sense of purpose, of belonging, of being part of something larger and more meaningful than his own story. "I'm happy," he said honestly. "Different happy than I was with Martha, but real happy, the kind of happy that comes from knowing your life matters." Lila nodded with satisfaction, as if she'd been worried about this question for some time and was relieved to have it settled. That evening, Frank sat at his kitchen table in the apartment above the bakery, writing the weekly report that he sent to the state agencies that funded Martha's Place. The numbers told part of the story: 17 people housed over 6 months, 12 successful transitions to permanent housing, 8 new jobs obtained, 3 GED certificates earned. But the numbers couldn't capture the real measure of success. The laughter he heard from the children who lived upstairs, the confidence he saw growing in their parents, the way former residents stopped by to visit and share news of their progress. As he wrote, Frank could hear the familiar sounds of evening in the building below: Rose cleaning up the kitchen after dinner service, residents helping their children with homework. The quiet conversations of people who'd found safety and were learning to hope again. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new residents, new stories of loss and resilience that would test his ability to offer support without judgment, hope without false promises. But tonight, in the warm circle of light cast by his desk lamp, Frank felt the deep satisfaction of someone who'd found his way back to a life worth living. Martha's photograph sat on the desk beside his paperwork, her smile as warm and encouraging as it had been in life. Frank touched the frame gently, thinking about the letter that had changed everything, the love that had found ways to keep growing, even after death had tried to stop it. "We did good work today," he said quietly, the words carrying across the gap between life and memory to the woman who'd made it all possible. "We're going to do good work tomorrow too." Outside his window, snow was beginning to fall. The same kind of gentle snowfall that had been drifting past Miller's bakery on the afternoon when a desperate man had asked a generous child if he could eat with her. But this time, Frank watched the snow with anticipation rather than dread, knowing that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to practice the simple truth that Lila had taught him so many months ago, that sharing was just what people did for one another, and that love, when given freely, always found ways to multiply.